So let me start this one by saying that I like mega churches. I go to mega churches. I believe, as I've said many times, Christianity takes on many different forms, most likely because it's supposed to take on many different forms, because many people find Jesus in many different ways. But there is something I can no longer unsee, a pattern that I think is worth calling out a little bit. Much of modern Protestant Christianity is organized around the self. It just is. In other words, you go to church for what you get out of it, which isn't bad, but you go for how it speaks to you. You go for how it makes you feel. You go for the pastor. And if the pastor leaves, you follow the guy. And that's not usually said out loud, but it's just how things work. If the preaching stops resonating, you just switch places. If the worship style changes, the attendance always drops. If the message no longer feels relevant to your season of life, you just go look elsewhere, or you don't go for a while. And that should give us pause, not because it's immoral, but because it's revealing. It tells us where the center of gravity actually is. There's a phrase you hear a lot from Protestant pastors, right? They say, I am the shepherd of this flock. And there is a sense in which that statement is true. But there's also a way that it becomes too true, because in practice, the pastor becomes the center, the primary interpreter of Scripture, the authority people trust, the gravitational pull of the community, which is strange because those same communities will insist correctly that we don't follow men, we follow Christ. But in reality, people do follow men. They follow this preacher, this communicator, this voice that finally makes things click. And when the man moves, the flock moves with him. That's not how sheep behave when they believe Christ himself is the shepherd. This doesn't make pastors villains, by no means. It makes them human, and it reveals something deeper about modern Christianity. It has adapted itself to modern people trained from birth to locate meaning inside their own experience. And this is where the tension sharpens. Protestantism often rests on Scripture alone, right? Sola Scriptura. No tradition, no magisterium, no accumulated authority, just the Bible. And yet every Sunday, a pastor stands up and translates Greek and Hebrew, explains historical context, resolves theological tensions, synthesizes doctrine, and tells you what the text means, which is exactly what Christians have done for 2,000 years. It's called Catholic. I'm just saying. So the difference isn't interpretation versus no interpretation. The difference is whether we admit we're interpreting. In practice, Scripture alone often becomes Scripture filtered through me, through my education, my temperament, my blind spots, my experience, my charisma, my season of life. And when people say they don't follow tradition, what they often mean is they follow a tradition that refuses to name itself as a tradition. And here comes the self. It slips right back in quietly. This is why Catholicism feels different. Not purer, not cleaner, not less sinful, just less about you. The priest is not the center. The homily is not the reason you go to Mass. Your emotional response isn't important. Sorry. The Mass happens whether you like it or not. Christ is present, whether the priest is dull or he's brilliant. The church remains whether its members succeed or fail. And this is deeply anti-modern. It refuses to let Christianity collapse into personality, preference, or private judgment. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee. But I think there's a third way. I don't think the answer is to reject the Protestant experience because it's fun and Christianity should be fun. I think what we're missing is time. For many people, Christianity has to begin with the self. It has to. It has to be about you at first. We're wounded. We're disordered. We're drowning. We need help. So, of course, the first encounter sounds like, what does this do for me? What is this Jesus guy going to do for me? Can he really save me? Can this heal me? Can this make sense of my pain? And that's not narcissism. That's need. Grace meets people where they are. And where most modern people are is trapped inside of their own heads, stuck in loops of self-analysis, starving for meaning. So God naturally meets them there. But that is not the destination. When Paul says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me," he's not being poetic. He's describing a death, not the death of the body, the death of the self as the center of the universe. The I that keeps asking, is this speaking to me? Am I getting something out of this? Is this optimized for my growth? That I is supposed to leave the room. Because if it doesn't, Christianity quietly becomes spiritual self-help. And it's just an endless feedback loop of insight, affirmation, emotional resonance, and personal optimization. And when the resonance fades, you go looking elsewhere. You just leave. A new church, a new teacher, a new season, back in the psychology books and self-help crap. Not because Christ failed, but because the self never stopped being the center. Eventually, we have to leave the room. This is the moment from encounter to participation. From what am I getting from this to what am I being drawn into? From the question of, is this for me? To, this is not about me. Never was about me. That's when Christianity stops feeling like content and starts feeling like a lived reality. You're no longer curating a spiritual experience. You're not entertaining yourself. You're entering a story that was already underway long before you arrived and will continue long after you're gone. Modern life trains us to ask one question on repeat. How is this affecting me? It's a boring question. Christianity answers that question once and then gently removes it. Not because you don't matter, but because you matter too much to remain trapped inside yourself. That the invitation here isn't to optimize the self with Christianity. It's to be emptied into something larger. God's action, God's time, and God's story. You don't manage it. You don't steer it. You consent to it. And then you live your actual days. You eat, you work, you suffer, you rejoice, you notice, you endure, you love. You love whoever is placed in front of you, not as the protagonist, as a participant. And here's the quiet grace in all of this. When the me leaves the room, the pressure leaves with it. You stop asking Christianity to validate you, to excite you, to affirm you, or constantly speak to your inner life, because it's no longer about you. And that's when peace arrives. That's when you feel that constant joy. Not the peace of optimization, the peace of belonging. And, well, that's what this was all about. You know, once again, I like the mega churches, but I think this is a better way.